After my father left me an $82 million empire, I thought grief was the hardest thing I would ever face. I was wrong. The first person who treated me like I didn't belong at my own father's funeral was my husband. The second was my sister. "Claire doesn't really understand the business side," Ethan said, with a polite smile while standing 3 feet away from me. Richard kept most of that information private. A few people nodded. Nobody looked at me. Nobody asked if what he said was true. An hour later, my sister Natalie lifted her champagne glass and quietly told a board member, "My sister has a good heart, but she's never been the strong one in the family." They both laughed softly. I heard every word. Then came the moment that made my stomach drop. One of my father's longtime executives looked directly at Ethan and asked, "So what's your plan now that you're basically running Whitmore Capital?" Ethan didn't correct him, he just smiled. And that was the moment I realized something had changed. Something I couldn't yet explain. If you've ever been underestimated by people who should have known your worth, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And if you're listening from somewhere in the world tonight, tell me your city or country and your local time in the comments. I always love seeing where these stories find a home. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, and what happened after my father's death changed everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the people I trusted most. The night I'm about to tell you about began with a funeral, but looking back now, I think it was really the beginning of an awakening. And the lesson I learned by the end of it was worth far more than any inheritance, so stay with me until the end of this journey. Now let me tell you where it all began. The day of my father's funeral arrived gray and cold over Greenwich, Connecticut. The kind of late October day when the sky looks like weathered steel and the trees seem to hold their breath. Cars lined the long driveway of the church. Men in dark coats stood in clusters near the entrance. Women spoke in low voices. The smell of fallen leaves mixed with damp air. I remember standing beside Ethan while people approached to offer condolences. Some hugged me. Some shook my hand. Most turned to Ethan after a few seconds. "Richard was an incredible man," one investor said. "The company will be in good hands." He wasn't looking at me when he said it. He was looking at my husband. Ethan nodded gravely. "We'll do everything we can to continue his vision." We. The word lingered in my mind. Throughout the service, I sat quietly in the front pew. My father's portrait rested near the altar. In the photograph, he was smiling the way he rarely smiled in public. Not CEO Richard Whitmore. Not founder Richard Whitmore. Just my dad. My chest tightened every time I looked at it. The organ music echoed softly through the sanctuary. Somewhere behind me, someone was crying. I stared at my hands and remembered being 14 years old, standing in a hospital hallway after my mother died. My father had pulled me close and said, "It's you and me now, Claire." For years I believed him. But as Whitmore Capital grew, board meetings replaced family dinners. Private jets replaced vacations. His love was always there, but it often arrived in the form of opportunities instead of time. Scholarships, mentors, internships, trust funds. Everything except what I secretly wanted most. More moments with him. More ordinary days. More chances to just be his daughter. After the burial, everyone gathered at our family estate overlooking Long Island Sound. The house had belonged to my father for almost 30 years. White stone, tall windows, a sweeping lawn that rolled toward the water. I grew up there, yet somehow that afternoon it felt like I was a guest in someone else's home. Conversations formed around me without including me. Decisions were discussed without consulting me. At one point, I walked into the library and found 2 board members speaking with Ethan. They stopped when they saw me. One cleared his throat. "Claire." The awkwardness lasted only a second before Ethan stepped forward. "We were just talking about the transition period." I waited. Nobody explained further. Nobody invited me into the discussion. Later, Natalie found me standing near the back terrace watching the water. "You okay?" she asked. "Not really." She adjusted the sleeve of her designer coat. "Dad worried about you, you know." I looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means he knew life could overwhelm you sometimes." Her voice sounded sympathetic, but something underneath it felt sharp. Thankfully, Ethan's good at handling pressure. I didn't answer. A gull drifted above the shoreline. The wind carried the scent of salt water across the lawn. Behind us, guests laughed softly over drinks and catered food. It felt wrong hearing laughter on the same day we buried my father. As evening approached, people gathered inside for the reading of the will. The room grew quiet. Margaret Sinclair, my father's attorney, opened a leather folder and adjusted her glasses. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking against the far wall. Ethan sat beside me. Natalie sat across from us. Then Margaret began to read. And as the first details emerged, I noticed something strange. Ethan leaned forward. Natalie stopped blinking. Neither of them looked surprised. They looked prepared, as if they had been waiting for this moment much longer than I had. And for the first time since my father's death, a small, uneasy feeling settled into my chest. A feeling that told me there was something happening beneath the surface of my family that I couldn't yet see. Margaret continued reading, her voice steady and measured, the kind of voice that had probably delivered life-changing news for decades without ever allowing emotion to interfere. Around me, chairs creaked softly, glasses clinked somewhere near the back of the room. Nobody seemed to realize that my entire body had gone still. The family residence shall remain under the ownership of Claire Whitmore. A pause. Control of Whitmore Capital Holdings and associated voting interests shall transfer to Claire Whitmore. Another pause, this one longer. I heard someone inhale sharply. Then silence settled over the room like fresh snow. Margaret lowered the document slightly. The estimated value of the estate currently exceeds $82 million. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, all I could hear was the ticking of the grandfather clock. Tick, tick, tick. Then the room changed. It is difficult to explain unless you have experienced it yourself. The faces remained the same, the people remained the same, yet somehow everything felt different. Eyes lingered longer. Conversation stopped when I looked up. Smiles became careful, calculated. I glanced toward Ethan. He was staring at the floor, not shocked, not emotional, thinking. Natalie crossed one leg over the other and folded her hands neatly in her lap. There was something almost unreadable in her expression. The attorney moved on to the remaining details, but I barely heard them. My mind had already drifted backward. Back through years I had spent trying to earn a place in rooms where I technically already belonged. Back to the first time I learned what it felt like to be overlooked. I was 15 when Whitmore Capital opened its new Manhattan office. I remember standing beside my father during the ribbon-cutting ceremony. I had spent an entire Saturday helping him rehearse his speech in our kitchen. He had forgotten half his notes. I helped reorganize them, suggested changes, even corrected 2 figures he accidentally switched. After the ceremony, a reporter approached us. "Mr. Whitmore, who helped prepare you for today?" My father smiled and pointed toward me. "My daughter." The reporter glanced at me for less than a second before turning back to him. "And who handled the actual planning?" Everyone laughed, including my father. Not because he meant to hurt me, because he did not notice. That happened a lot. The memory faded as voices slowly returned around me. Guests were beginning to stand. Conversations restarted. Chairs moved across hardwood floors. Ethan finally leaned closer. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I looked at him. "I do not know." He squeezed my hand. "That is understandable." His voice sounded warm, caring, exactly the way it always had. Yet for some reason I found myself studying his face longer than usual, trying to understand something I could not name. Across the room, Natalie was speaking with 2 board members. They were smiling. One of them shook her hand. Another nodded. She caught me watching and lifted her glass slightly. A polite gesture. Nothing more. Yet that uneasy feeling returned. Later that evening, after most guests had left, I wandered through the house alone. The estate felt different without my father. Larger somehow. Quieter. The halls seemed longer. The shadows deeper. I walked into his study and stopped near the window overlooking Long Island Sound. The water reflected the moonlight in broken silver fragments. My father used to stand there after difficult meetings, hands in his pockets, looking out at the ocean while pretending he was not thinking about work. "You always know when I am upset," I once told him. He smiled without turning around. "Because you inherited that from your mother." I swallowed hard. Some losses never shrink. They simply learn how to live beside you. My phone buzzed suddenly. A text from Natalie. "Are you still awake?" I stared at the message for a moment before replying, "Yes." A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Dad always believed in you. I hope you know that." I frowned. It was a kind message, yet something about it felt strange. Maybe because she had never said things like that before. Maybe because grief makes everyone sound unfamiliar. Or maybe because of the way she had acted all afternoon. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Around midnight, Ethan found me in the kitchen. I was making tea. The kettle hummed softly on the stove. "You should get some sleep," he said. "You have had a long day." I nodded. "Did Dad ever talk to you about the company?" The question came out before I realized I was asking it. Ethan paused. Just briefly. "Sometimes. About me?" Another pause. "Not really." He opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water. "Honestly, Claire, I think he wanted to protect you from all that pressure." "Protect me?" I stared at the steam rising from my mug. It was a phrase I had heard my entire life. Protect Claire. Let Claire focus on other things. Claire does not need to worry about that. The strange thing about being protected for long enough is that eventually people stop seeing what you are capable of. Even you. Ethan touched my shoulder gently. "Get some rest." After he left, I remained there for several minutes. The kitchen clock read 12:17 a.m. Outside, wind brushed against the windows. Somewhere upstairs, floorboards creaked, the house settling into the night. Then another memory surfaced. 3 years earlier. A charity gala in New York. One of my father's investors had spent 20 minutes discussing expansion opportunities with Ethan while I sat beside them. Finally, I offered an opinion about commercial development in South Florida. The investor blinked in surprise. "You follow that stuff?" Ethan laughed lightly. "Claire reads everything." Everyone laughed with him. The conversation moved on. Nobody asked what I actually knew. At the time, I laughed too. It seemed easier, less awkward. Now, standing alone in the kitchen years later, I wondered how many times I had quietly accepted being underestimated simply because it felt more comfortable than correcting people. I carried my tea upstairs and paused outside my father's study one final time. The door was slightly open. A thin line of light stretched across the hallway floor. Strange. I was certain I had turned the lamp off before leaving. Slowly, I pushed the door wider. The room was empty, but something had changed. One of the desk drawers was not fully closed. I knew that desk. My father was meticulous. He never left drawers open. Ever. A cold sensation moved through me. Small, subtle, easy to dismiss. Yet I could not dismiss it. Because for the first time all day, I had the distinct feeling that someone had been inside that room after I left, and whatever they had been looking for, they had not wanted anyone to know. For several seconds I stood in the doorway of my father's study without moving. The lamp on the corner table cast a warm circle of light across the leather sofa and the Persian rug beneath it. Everything looked normal at first glance, yet something felt off. The drawer remained slightly open, no more than an inch, just enough to catch my attention. My father had many habits. Some people called them quirks, others called them discipline. But one thing was certain. Richard Whitmore never left a drawer open. Ever. I crossed the room slowly. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet. Outside, the wind rolled across Long Island Sound and rattled the branches beyond the windows. My fingers touched the brass handle. Inside were folders, pens, old correspondence. Nothing appeared missing. Nothing appeared disturbed. Yet a faint uneasiness lingered. The kind that settles in your stomach before your mind understands why. I closed the drawer and looked around the room one more time. Then I noticed something else. A framed photograph near the bookshelf sat at a slightly different angle. Most people would never have noticed. I did because I had spent half my life in that room. The photograph showed my father and me at Fenway Park when I was 12. We were both wearing Red Sox caps. He had his arm around my shoulders. I picked it up carefully. Dust marked the wood beneath the frame. Someone had moved it recently. My pulse quickened. Not dramatically. Just enough to make me aware of my own breathing. I set the photograph back down and left the study. Sleep never came that night. The next morning the estate felt strangely alive again. Caterers arrived to collect equipment from the previous day. Staff moved through the hallways. Phones rang. Cars came and went from the driveway. Life was continuing whether I was ready or not. Around 10 o'clock I walked into the breakfast room overlooking the water. Ethan sat at the table reading financial reports on his tablet. A cup of coffee steamed beside him. He looked up and smiled. "Morning. Morning." I poured myself coffee. "You are working already?" "Somebody has to keep things moving." His tone sounded harmless. Maybe it was. Yet the words landed differently than they would have a week earlier. He slid the tablet toward me. "A few board members want to schedule meetings." "With me?" I asked. Ethan hesitated. "Mostly with both of us." I sat down. "Why both of us?" "Because they are nervous." "About what?" He folded his hands together. "Claire, this is a major company. Investors want stability." I stared into my coffee. "You mean they want someone they recognize?" "That is not what I said, but it is what you meant." Silence stretched between us. Ethan sighed. "Look, I am trying to help." "Help with what?" "Managing expectations." I felt something tighten inside me. Not anger exactly, something older. Familiar. The feeling of being spoken about rather than spoken to. "I can manage my own expectations," I said quietly. Ethan offered a patient smile. The same smile he often used when explaining things. "I know you think that. Think that." The phrase lingered long after the conversation ended. Later that afternoon, another meeting took place in the library. 3 senior executives from Whitmore Capital arrived, men who had worked with my father for years, men I had known since childhood. I expected questions, discussions, maybe even concerns. What I did not expect was for most of the conversation to happen as though I were not in the room. "The transition period needs structure," one executive said. Ethan nodded. "Agreed." Another spoke. "Investors will feel more comfortable if there is a clear leadership figure." Ethan nodded again. "That makes sense." I sat quietly for several minutes before finally asking, "And what exactly is my role in this conversation?" The room went still. One of the men cleared his throat. Another adjusted his tie. Ethan answered first. "Nobody is excluding you." "Really?" I asked. "Because everyone keeps discussing my father's company as if I inherited a seat in the audience." Nobody responded immediately. The silence told me more than words could have. When the meeting finally ended, the executives left quickly. Ethan remained behind. "You did not need to make that uncomfortable." I laughed softly. "Not because anything was funny. I made it uncomfortable. You know what I mean." "No, Ethan. I actually do not." His expression hardened slightly. Just for a second. Then it disappeared. "People are trying to help you." There it was again. Help. Protect. Manage. Words I had heard my entire life. Different voices. Same message. "We do not fully trust you with your own future." That evening, Natalie arrived unexpectedly. She carried a bottle of wine and a smile that looked practiced. We sat on the back terrace overlooking the water. The October air felt cool against my skin. For a while we talked about ordinary things. The weather, the funeral, family friends. Then the conversation shifted. "You know," Natalie said casually, "Dad probably never expected all of this to land on your shoulders." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She swirled her wine slowly. $82 million. A major corporation. It is a lot for one person, I suppose. Especially someone who never really wanted that world. There was something beneath her words. Something carefully disguised. "And how would you know what I wanted?" I asked. Natalie smiled. "Come on, Claire. You always hated boardrooms." "No. I hated being ignored in boardrooms." Her smile faded for a fraction of a second. Then she looked away. The sun was beginning to set beyond the water. Orange light stretched across the horizon. "I am just saying," she continued, "there are people better equipped to handle certain responsibilities." There it was, finally. Not hidden, not disguised. The thing both of them seemed to believe. I was not the right person. I was simply the person who inherited it. A temporary obstacle between them and something they thought belonged elsewhere. Hours later, after Natalie left, I walked past the study again. The door was closed this time. Locked. That caught my attention immediately. My father never locked that room inside the house. Never. I stood there for several seconds staring at the brass handle. Then I heard footsteps approaching behind me. "Ethan? Looking for something?" he asked. His voice sounded casual. too casual. I turned toward him. Why is the study locked? Probably staff. Staff do not lock doors in this house. He shrugged lightly. Then maybe somebody wanted privacy. His answer arrived too quickly, almost as if he had expected the question. Then he added something that made every nerve in my body go still. Some things your father left behind are probably better left alone. He smiled afterward. Small, relaxed, ordinary. But in that moment I realized something. Ethan was not just trying to control the future. He was trying to control the past. And whatever secret my father had left behind, Ethan already knew enough about it to be worried. The next morning I woke before sunrise. For a few seconds I forgot where I was. Then reality settled back into place. My father was gone. The house no longer felt like home. And somewhere inside those walls, a secret existed that someone desperately wanted hidden. A pale blue light stretched across the ceiling as dawn arrived over Long Island Sound. I sat at the edge of the bed listening to the silence. Ethan was already awake. His side of the mattress was empty. I could hear distant voices downstairs. Low, careful, the kind of voices people use when they do not want to be overheard. By the time I reached the kitchen, the conversation had ended. Ethan stood alone near the coffee machine. He looked up and smiled. Morning. Morning. I have a conference call in 20 minutes. He poured coffee into a travel mug. Investors are nervous. They seem nervous a lot lately. He laughed softly. That is what investors do. Then he kissed my forehead and left. The front door closed. His car disappeared down the driveway. I stood at the window longer than necessary, watching the empty road. Something inside me had changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. More like the first crack in ice before spring arrives. Small, quiet, irreversible. Around 11 o'clock my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I recognized immediately. Margaret Sinclair, my father's attorney. Claire? Her voice sounded calm as always. Do you have time to come into Boston today? Today? Yes. A pause followed. There is something your father instructed me to give you personally. I looked out toward the water. Why not send it? Because he specifically said not to. The pause that followed felt heavier than the first one. Can you be here by 2? I will leave now. 3 hours later I was driving through Beacon Hill beneath rows of old brick buildings glowing amber in the autumn sunlight. Boston always felt different from New York. Older, slower. The streets seemed to carry their history openly, instead of hiding it beneath glass towers. Margaret's office occupied the upper floor of a building that looked as though it had been standing there for a century. Dark wood. Brass fixtures. Quiet hallways. The receptionist led me into a private conference room overlooking Charles Street. Margaret was already waiting. A leather folder rested on the polished table beside her. She stood when I entered. Thank you for coming. You sounded serious. I am. We sat down. For a moment she simply studied me. Not in an uncomfortable way. More like someone deciding how much truth another person is ready to hear. Finally she slid the folder toward me. Your father gave me this 8 months ago. I frowned. 8 months? She nodded. He instructed me to deliver it only under specific circumstances. My pulse quickened slightly. What circumstances? Margaret folded her hands. His death. The room suddenly felt smaller. I opened the folder carefully. Inside lay a sealed envelope. My name appeared across the front in my father's handwriting. Claire, just that, nothing more. For several seconds I stared at it without moving. Seeing his handwriting again hit me harder than I expected. The familiar curves of each letter, the slight slant, the pressure marks from his pen. It felt impossibly personal, like hearing his voice after weeks of silence. Take your time, Margaret said softly. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The first line stole the air from my lungs. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and there are things I should have told you sooner. I swallowed hard and continued. The letter was not about money. It was not about the company. It was not about inheritance. It was about me. About mistakes he believed he had made as a father. About missing birthdays because of business trips. Missing school events. Missing ordinary moments he could never get back. Tears blurred the words for a moment. I blinked them away and kept reading. Then the tone changed. If something ever feels wrong around you, trust yourself. Do not allow anyone to convince you that your instincts are weakness. Your instincts have saved this company more times than you know. I stopped reading. My eyes returned to the sentence. Saved this company more times than you know. I looked up. What does that mean? Margaret's expression remained neutral. Keep reading. So I did. Several paragraphs later, another sentence appeared, one that made my heartbeat stumble. There are people who underestimate you because they only see the version of you that you allow them to see. That has always been their mistake. Never yours. I stared at the page, slowly, quietly. Pieces of my life began rearranging themselves. Memories surfaced. Meetings, conversations, recommendations my father had accepted without ever publicly crediting me. Decisions that shaped projects nobody knew I helped design. Suddenly, the picture looked different, not because my father had ignored me, but because he had been protecting something. Or perhaps preparing something. Margaret opened a drawer beside her chair and removed a small brass key. She placed it gently on the table between us. There is more. What is that? A safe deposit box. I looked at the key. What is inside? I do not know. You never opened it? Your father was very specific. She paused. Only you. Silence filled the room. Outside, traffic moved slowly along the street below. Somewhere down the hall, a printer hummed briefly. Life continued as normal, while mine seemed to tilt sideways. Then Margaret said something unexpected. Claire, may I ask you a question? Of course. Has anyone been acting differently since the reading of the will? I looked at her carefully. Why would you ask that? For the first time since I arrived, her professional mask slipped slightly. Not much, just enough to reveal concern, because Richard was worried. The room went very still. Worried about what? She held my gaze. Not the company. Another pause. You. My stomach tightened. Every instinct I had been ignoring for days suddenly demanded attention. The study, the locked door, the moved photograph, the careful conversations. Ethan's strange comment. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Your father trusted very few people completely. And, near the end, that list became even shorter. I looked down at the brass key resting on the table. Small. Ordinary. Yet somehow it felt heavier than anything I had touched in weeks. Then Margaret said the sentence that changed everything. Claire, I think someone has already started looking for whatever is inside that box. The drive back to Greenwich felt longer than usual. The brass key sat inside my purse on the passenger seat, hidden beneath receipts and sunglasses, looking far too ordinary for something that suddenly seemed capable of changing my entire life. Traffic crawled through afternoon congestion outside New Haven, before finally opening into long stretches of highway lined with bare trees and fading autumn color. I kept hearing Margaret's voice. Your father was worried. Not the company, you. The words followed me all the way home. By the time I turned into the estate driveway, dusk had settled over the property. The windows glowed warmly against the darkening sky. From a distance it looked peaceful. Normal. Yet lately I had begun to understand that appearances could be dangerously misleading. Inside, Ethan was standing in the kitchen speaking on his phone. The moment he saw me, he ended the call. Boston went longer than expected, he said casually. How is Margaret? Fine. I hung my coat near the door. She had paperwork. Anything important? The question came quickly. Too quickly. I opened the refrigerator and reached for a bottle of water. Mostly legal housekeeping. Ethan nodded once. Good. His expression remained calm, but something in his eyes seemed to be measuring my answer, evaluating it. For the first time since our marriage began, I found myself giving him only part of the truth. The realization felt strange. Like learning a language I never wanted to speak. That night I barely slept. Around 3 a.m, I sat in the library with my father's letters spread across the desk. I read certain passages over and over. One sentence in particular refused to leave me alone. There are people who underestimate you because they only see the version of you that you allow them to see. I stared at the words until sunrise, maybe because they felt less like advice and more like a clue. The following morning brought another meeting at Whitmore Capital headquarters in Stamford. The building stood 30 stories above the harbor, all glass and steel and quiet confidence. I had walked through those doors hundreds of times throughout my life. Yet most employees only knew me as Richard Whitmore's daughter. Few knew anything else. The elevator opened onto the executive floor. Conversations softened as I passed, not out of disrespect, out of uncertainty. People did not quite know what to do with me now. Inside the boardroom, several directors were already seated. Ethan stood near the windows reviewing notes. Natalie had somehow managed to secure an invitation despite holding no formal role within the company. That alone irritated me. The meeting began with financial projections, market forecasts, investment strategies, familiar territory. Yet as discussion moved forward, something unexpected happened. One director presented a proposal involving a commercial development project outside Tampa. As he spoke, I recognized a flaw immediately. The numbers looked attractive on paper but ignored major infrastructure costs. I waited. Nobody mentioned it. Finally, I spoke. Your transportation estimates are outdated. The room turned toward me. The director blinked. Excuse me? The county expanded permitting requirements 18 months ago. I pointed toward one of the charts. Those costs are missing. Silence. Then another board member frowned. How do you know that? I hesitated briefly. Because I reviewed the expansion model when it was first proposed. Several people exchanged confused looks. One man shuffled through his notes. That project was confidential. I know. More silence. Ethan looked at me carefully. You never mentioned that. I met his gaze. You never asked. The room remained quiet for several seconds. Then another director leaned forward. Wait, were you involved in the original feasibility review? Partially? I almost smiled. I built most of the operational forecasts. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Chairs shifted. Eyes narrowed. People began looking at me differently. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The meeting continued. Another proposal appeared, then another, and with each discussion, pieces of information surfaced naturally. Things I knew, projects I had touched, decisions I had influenced. By lunchtime, several directors looked genuinely unsettled, not because I was speaking, because they were realizing how much they had never known. After the meeting ended, an older board member named Charles Bennett approached me near the elevators. Charles had worked with my father for over 20 years. He was not easily impressed. Claire. Charles. He studied me for a moment. Your father used to bring your reports into meetings. I blinked. What? Years ago. He smiled faintly. Most people assumed they came from outside consultants. They did not? He laughed softly. No. A pause followed. Richard rarely corrected them. I stared at him. Why? Charles glanced toward the boardroom. I think he wanted you judged by the quality of your ideas instead of your last name. Then he added something that stayed with me long after he walked away. The funny thing is, your ideas usually won. That afternoon, I sat alone in my office overlooking Stamford Harbor. My office. The thought still felt strange. For years I had operated in the background. Quietly, intentionally. Not because I lacked confidence. Because visibility had never interested me. Results did. My father understood that. Apparently better than I did. The realization brought an unexpected mixture of pride and sadness. Pride because I was finally beginning to see myself clearly. Sadness because the person who believed in me most was no longer here to explain why he had hidden so much. Near sunset, my office phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I did not recognize. This is Claire Whitmore, a woman answered. Miss Whitmore, my name is Evelyn Parker. Her voice sounded calm and professional. I worked with your father for 27 years. I sat up straighter. Evelyn Parker? Yes. I remembered the name immediately. Executive assistant. Gatekeeper. The woman who knew every schedule. Every meeting. Every private conversation worth knowing. I was hoping we could meet. About what? A brief silence followed. Then she said, There are things your father wanted you to understand. My pulse quickened. What kind of things? Another pause. Longer this time. The kind that explain why certain people are behaving the way they are. The room suddenly felt very still. Outside, the harbor reflected the fading light of evening. Boats drifted slowly across the water. Everything looked peaceful, Yet I could feel something larger moving beneath the surface. Evelyn spoke again. "Your father spent the last year preparing for something, Claire." "Preparing for what?" Her answer came quietly. "The possibility that you would eventually need protection from people much closer than you realize." The following afternoon I met Evelyn Parker at a small waterfront restaurant in Mystic, Connecticut, a place far enough from Greenwich to avoid familiar faces and quiet enough for a serious conversation. The harbor outside was filled with white sailboats rocking gently against their moorings. Seagulls drifted above the water. Everything looked calm. That seemed to be a theme lately. Calm surfaces hiding complicated truths. Evelyn was already seated when I arrived. She stood as I approached. She was in her late 50s, dressed simply, with silver strands woven through dark hair and the steady posture of someone who had spent years managing powerful people without ever becoming impressed by them. "Claire," she said warmly, "you look so much like your mother. Nobody had said that to me in years." For a moment I forgot why I was there. Then reality returned. We sat down. Coffee arrived. Neither of us touched it. Evelyn studied me for a few seconds before speaking. "Your father loved you more than anyone in this world." I smiled faintly. He had a strange way of showing it sometimes. "Yes." She nodded. He knew that. The honesty in her answer caught me off guard. She was not defending him. She was telling the truth. Margaret said he was worried. Evelyn folded her hands together. "He was. About Ethan?" A pause. "Not only Ethan." My stomach tightened slightly. "Then who?" Evelyn glanced toward the harbor before looking back at me. "Anyone who saw your father as an opportunity instead of a person." The words lingered between us. "He started noticing things last year." "What things?" "Questions. Questions. Questions about trust structures, voting rights, transfer procedures, access permissions." I felt my pulse quicken. Who was asking them? Evelyn held my gaze. People who had no legitimate reason to ask. Silence settled over the table. Somewhere nearby, a boat horn echoed across the water. "Did he tell you names?" I asked. "No." "Why not?" "Because he preferred evidence over assumptions." That sounded exactly like my father. I stared down at my untouched coffee. "I keep feeling like there is something everyone else knows except me." Evelyn's expression softened. "Then perhaps it is time someone corrected that." She reached into her leather bag and removed a thin folder. Not thick, not dramatic. Just a simple folder secured with a rubber band. She slid it across the table. "What is this?" "Documents your father authorized me to keep." I opened it carefully. Inside were meeting summaries, internal memos, notes written in my father's handwriting. Most were routine. Then one page caught my attention. At the top, dated 11 months earlier, was a sentence underlined twice. "Claire's recommendations reduced projected losses by 22%. I frowned. Another page. "Strategic expansion model approved. Original proposal prepared by CW." Another. "Risk assessment accepted. Credit to internal development team." More pages followed. More examples. More evidence. My throat tightened. These were mine. Evelyn nodded. "Yes. Nobody knew." "Your father knew." I looked up. "Why keep it hidden?" She smiled sadly. "Because he wanted your work judged before your name was attached to it." I leaned back slowly. Years of memories rearranged themselves. Meetings where ideas appeared under different labels. Projects that moved forward without acknowledgement. Recommendations adopted without explanation. For years I thought I was invisible. Now I was beginning to understand that I had never been invisible at all. Someone had simply been watching from a distance, believing in me quietly. "There is more," Evelyn said. She pointed toward the final section of the folder. There, attached to several documents, were copies of access logs from Whitmore Capital, dates, times, user records. I studied them carefully. One name appeared repeatedly. Ethan. Requests for restricted files. Requests involving trust structures. Requests involving inheritance scenarios. My chest grew cold. These were before Dad died. Yes, months before. Yes. I looked up slowly. Did Dad know? Evelyn nodded. Eventually. The restaurant suddenly felt very quiet. Not because people had stopped talking, because I could no longer hear them. Why didn't he confront him? I asked. Because he wanted certainty. She paused. And because he was protecting you. Outside, sunlight reflected across the harbor in shimmering patterns. I watched it for a moment. Then my phone vibrated on the table. Ethan, calling. I stared at the screen. Evelyn noticed immediately. Are you going to answer? Yes. I accepted the call. Hey, where are you? Ethan asked. His tone sounded casual. Too casual. Out. Out where? I almost smiled. A month ago I would not have noticed the question. Now I did. Connecticut. That narrows it down. He laughed lightly. Everything okay? I glanced at the folder. At the documents. At the evidence that had quietly accumulated long before I knew it existed. Everything is fine, I said. Good. A pause followed. You know I am only trying to help, right? There was that word again. Help. I looked out across the harbor. I know. We ended the call. Evelyn remained silent for several seconds. Finally, she asked, Do you still trust him? The question hung in the air. Not because I lacked an answer, because I was finally afraid I knew it. I do not know anymore. Evelyn nodded slowly. That is an honest answer. She gathered her things and stood. Your father always said something about you. What? That when the truth finally arrived, you would not need revenge. She smiled faintly. You would only need facts. After she left, I remained at the table watching the water. For the first time since the funeral, I understood that the balance of power had already started shifting. Not because I had attacked anyone, not because I had exposed anyone, simply because the truth had begun surfacing on its own. And the strange thing about truth is that once it starts appearing, the people who fear it most often reveal themselves without any help at all. That evening, when I returned to the estate, I found Ethan pacing alone in the library. The moment he saw me, he stopped. His expression looked controlled, but only barely. Claire, he said, we need to talk. And for the first time since I married him, I realized he looked less confident than I did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The library felt unusually quiet. The fireplace crackled softly behind us. Shadows moved across the bookshelves as evening settled over the estate. Ethan stood near the center of the room with one hand resting against the back of a leather chair. He looked composed at first glance. But after years of marriage, I knew the difference between calm and effort. This was effort. What do we need to talk about? I asked. Ethan exhaled slowly. The company. I almost smiled. A week earlier that answer would have satisfied me. Now it sounded like a shield. What about it? There are concerns. Whose concerns? A brief pause. Several people. I waited. He continued. The board is nervous. The board seems nervous every day. Ethan looked away toward the fireplace. This is different. How? Another pause. Longer this time. Some directors feel you are moving too quickly. I studied him carefully. Interesting. What is? Nobody mentioned that during the meeting. His jaw tightened slightly. Not everything gets discussed in the room. Apparently, silence stretched between us. Then he took a different approach. Claire, I am trying to prevent mistakes. There was that familiar tone again. The patient one. The reasonable one. The voice that suggested concern while quietly questioning my judgment. But something had changed. For the first time, I heard it clearly. And what mistake am I about to make? I asked. Ethan hesitated, trusting the wrong people. I almost laughed at the irony. Instead, I simply nodded. That is good advice. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for me. The conversation ended shortly afterward. He went upstairs. I remained in the library. Through the windows, darkness settled across the lawn. Somewhere in the distance, waves rolled against the shoreline. I sat alone for nearly an hour thinking about everything Evelyn had shown me. The access requests, the documents, the questions asked long before my father died. None of it proved a crime. None of it proved a conspiracy. But it revealed something equally important. Intent, curiosity, interest. The next morning brought an unexpected development. I arrived at Whitmore Capital shortly before 9. The executive floor felt different immediately. Conversations stopped when I entered. Employees exchanged uncertain glances. 2 assistants whispered near the reception desk. Something was happening. By 10 o'clock, I discovered what it was. Natalie. She had been contacting people throughout the company. Not officially, not publicly. Quietly, informally. Suggesting that the organization needed stronger leadership during the transition period. Suggesting investors felt uneasy. Suggesting difficult decisions might require experienced guidance. Her guidance. Or Ethan's. Or both. The strategy might have worked if they had coordinated better. Instead, they began contradicting each other. Around noon, I learned Ethan had been making entirely different promises to some of the same people. One executive mentioned it accidentally during a meeting. "That is strange," he said. "Natalie told us something completely different." The room went silent. Another executive frowned. "Natalie said Ethan supported her proposal." A third looked confused. "Ethan told me he was distancing himself from her involvement." Nobody knew what to say next. Neither did I, because suddenly a pattern was emerging. Not unity, not planning, friction, tiny fractures spreading beneath the surface. That afternoon, Charles Bennett stopped by my office. He closed the door behind him and sat down. "You look surprisingly calm." I smiled faintly. Should I not be? Most people would be panicking. About what? Charles leaned back in his chair. "The fact that half the rumors in this building seem to involve your family." I laughed softly. "Only half?" He smiled. Then his expression became serious. "Something interesting is happening." "What?" "People who were very confident a week ago are suddenly becoming defensive." I thought about that after he left. Defensive. It was the perfect word. By Thursday, the situation had worsened. Not for me. For them. Natalie began calling board members directly. Several informed me afterward. Some sounded uncomfortable. Others sounded annoyed. One finally said what everyone else was thinking. "She seems very interested in decisions that are not hers to make." Meanwhile, Ethan started questioning internal reports, challenging recommendations, requesting additional reviews. On paper, those actions appeared reasonable. In reality, they slowed everything down. The more pressure he applied, the more attention he attracted. And attention was becoming dangerous. Friday morning brought the first visible crack. I was walking through the executive corridor when I heard raised voices coming from a conference room. Not shouting, sharp disagreement. The door was partially open. I recognized both voices immediately. Ethan. Natalie. I stopped several feet away, not close enough to eavesdrop intentionally, close enough to hear fragments. That was not the plan. Natalie's voice. Tight. Frustrated. Ethan answered immediately. "Because your plan was reckless." "My plan?" she snapped. "You were the one changing everything." A chair moved, papers rustled, then silence. A second later, the door opened. Natalie emerged first. She froze when she saw me. Ethan appeared behind her. Neither looked pleased. The moment lasted only seconds, yet it revealed more than either of them intended. Natalie forced a smile. Claire. Natalie. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, she walked away. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she disappeared down the hallway. Ethan watched her leave before turning toward me. "Family disagreements happen, do they?" I asked. "All the time." He tried to sound casual. It did not work. For the first time since all of this began, I saw something unfamiliar in his expression. Not confidence, not control, uncertainty. The realization stayed with me throughout the day. I was not watching a carefully executed strategy unfold. I was watching people lose control of one, and the more uncertain they became, the more mistakes they made. Late that evening, I returned to the estate. The house felt unusually still. I walked into the kitchen and found an envelope waiting on the counter. No stamp, no return address, just my name written neatly across the front. Claire. My heartbeat quickened slightly. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, one sentence, typed. Simple. Direct. "There is a reason your father never let certain people know what you were really doing inside the company." Then beneath that sentence was a time, a location, and a name I had not heard in years. The name of someone who knew exactly how much of my father's hidden plan was still buried beneath the surface. The name at the bottom of the note was Daniel Foster. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. I had not spoken to Daniel in almost 7 years. Back when Whitmore Capital was expanding into several new markets, Daniel had worked as an independent forensic consultant. He was one of those rare people who could walk into a room full of numbers and somehow see the story hiding behind them. My father trusted him. That alone made the note impossible to ignore. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning at a small cafe near the shoreline in Newport, Rhode Island. I arrived early. The air smelled of salt and rain. Fishing boats rocked gently in the harbor. A few tourists wandered along the waterfront, carrying coffee cups and speaking in quiet voices. Life felt ordinary there, peaceful. It was the first place I had been in weeks where nobody seemed to care about Whitmore Capital, inheritance disputes, board meetings, or family politics. Daniel arrived exactly on time. He looked older than I remembered. More gray around the temples. The same steady eyes. The same calm presence. Claire. He smiled warmly. It has been a long time. Too long. We sat near the window overlooking the water. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things. Families. Health. Life. Then eventually he reached into his briefcase and removed a thin folder. I immediately recognized the expression on his face. It was not excitement. It was concern. "Your father contacted me about a year ago," he said. "He wanted an independent review of several unusual patterns." "What kind of patterns?" Daniel looked out the window briefly before answering. "The kind that make responsible people uncomfortable." He opened the folder. Inside were summaries, timelines, notes. None of it felt dramatic. No shocking revelations. No movie-style surprises. Just facts. Quiet facts. The kind that become powerful when placed side by side. As he explained what he had found, something unexpected happened inside me. I did not feel angry. I did not feel vindicated. I felt tired. Deeply tired. Not because of the documents, because I suddenly realized how much energy I had spent carrying other people's expectations. My father's expectations, Ethan's expectations, Natalie's expectations, the board's expectations, even my own. Daniel noticed my silence. "Are you all right?" I smiled faintly. "I think so. You do not sound convinced." I looked out toward the harbor. A father and daughter were walking along the dock together. The little girl could not have been older than 8. She was pointing excitedly at the boats while her father listened as though every word mattered. Something tightened in my chest. "My father spent years building an empire," I said quietly, "and all anyone seems interested in now is who gets control of it." Daniel nodded. "That happens more often than people realize." I stared at the water. "I am beginning to think that is the least important part of all this." The conversation shifted after that. Less about investigations, more about perspective. Daniel told me something my father had said years earlier during a difficult business negotiation. "Richard once told me that money solves financial problems, but it never solves loneliness." I laughed softly. "That sounds like him." He said most people spend their lives chasing the wrong scoreboard. The words stayed with me. That evening I drove north, instead of returning directly to Greenwich. Without fully planning it, I found myself heading toward Nantucket. My father had owned a small beach house there for years. Nothing extravagant. Just a quiet, gray-shingled home overlooking the Atlantic. We used to visit when I was younger, before board meetings replaced weekends, before responsibilities became excuses. I arrived after dark. The house smelled faintly of cedarwood and ocean air. Everything looked exactly as I remembered. The old reading chair, the weathered kitchen table, the framed photographs lining the hallway. For the first time in weeks, nobody expected anything from me. There were no investors, no attorneys, no strategic conversations, only silence. The good kind, the healing kind. The next morning I walked along the beach shortly after sunrise. Waves rolled gently across the sand. A cold breeze moved through the dunes. I watched seabirds drift across the pale sky. Somewhere along that shoreline, I realized something important. The conflict consuming everyone else was no longer consuming me. Ethan and Natalie were still tangled in their own decisions. The board was still debating power. Lawyers were still reviewing documents. Yet standing there beside the Atlantic Ocean, none of it felt as important as it had before. My father was gone. No victory could change that. No public embarrassment could heal that loss. No amount of money could recreate a single conversation I would never have with him again. Later that afternoon, I opened a closet I had not touched in years. Inside was a weathered storage box. My father's handwriting appeared across the top. Personal. My pulse quickened. I carried it to the kitchen table and opened it carefully. Inside were photographs, letters, birthday cards, old drawings from elementary school. Small pieces of a life I had almost forgotten. One photograph stopped me immediately. It showed me at 16, standing beside my father near this very beach. I was laughing. He was looking at me instead of the camera. The expression on his face caught me off guard. Pride, pure and unmistakable. Beneath the photograph was a handwritten note. Just one sentence that brought tears to my eyes. Never doubt who you are, Claire. One day the world will see what I already see. And for the first time since the funeral, I sat quietly beside the ocean, holding that note in my hands, and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Peace. 2 years later, I found myself standing on the same stretch of Nantucket shoreline where I had once sat alone with my father's note in my hands, trying to understand what remained after loss. The ocean looked exactly the same. The waves still rolled toward the sand with quiet certainty. The wind still carried the scent of salt and cedar. The gulls still drifted overhead without any concern for boardrooms, inheritances, reputations, or family conflicts. Yet everything inside me felt different. Time had done what time often does. It had not erased the pain, it had simply given it a place to rest. Whitmore Capital continued to grow, not because of dramatic decisions or bold headlines, because hundreds of good people continued showing up every day and doing honest work. The company was healthier than it had been in years. Investors regained confidence. Employees regained stability. The endless speculation eventually faded because reality proved stronger than rumors. As for Ethan, life moved forward for him too. The questions surrounding his actions created consequences he could not avoid. Professional relationships disappeared. Opportunities became harder to find. People who once trusted him became more cautious. No dramatic collapse. No public spectacle. Just the natural result of choices catching up with the person who made them. Natalie experienced something similar. Many friendships faded. Connections weakened. The influence she once hoped to gain never materialized. Over time, she moved away from Connecticut and built a quieter life elsewhere. We rarely spoke. Not because I hated her, because some relationships survive difficult seasons, and some do not. That is one of the hardest truths adulthood teaches us. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not always the same thing. Sometimes forgiveness simply means putting down the weight you no longer wish to carry. One spring afternoon, almost 18 months after everything changed, I received a letter from Natalie. It was short, honest. She did not make excuses. She did not blame anyone else. She simply acknowledged mistakes and wished me peace. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I placed it inside a drawer and went for a walk along the harbor. Not every wound requires a response. Some only require understanding. Evelyn remained part of my life. So did Margaret. So did Daniel. It turned out that the people who helped me most were not the people who promised loyalty the loudest. They were the people who quietly showed up when things became difficult. The people who valued truth more than convenience. The people who never needed anything from me in return. Those became my real family. Not because we shared blood, because we shared character. A year after the turmoil ended, we established the Whitmore Legacy Scholarship in my father's name. The program helped students who had lost a parent during childhood pursue college educations they might otherwise never afford. During the first scholarship ceremony, I met a young woman named Emma. She stood nervously at the podium holding prepared remarks in trembling hands. Halfway through her speech, she looked up and said something I will never forget. When you lose someone important, people keep telling you to be strong, but sometimes what helps most is knowing somebody else understands. The room became very quiet. I thought about my father. I thought about my mother. I thought about all the years I spent searching for validation from people who could never truly give it, and I realized Emma was right. Understanding heals in ways advice never can. Later that evening, after the guests left, I returned to the beach house alone. The sun was setting over the Atlantic. Orange light stretched across the water. Inside the house, resting on a shelf above the fireplace, sat the photograph I had found in that old storage box. The one showing my 16-year-old self laughing beside my father. For a long time, I simply stood there looking at it. Not with sadness, not anymore. With gratitude. Because eventually I understood something that had taken me years to learn. My father had never been trying to build an empire for me. He had been trying to build confidence within me. The company, the money, the inheritance. Those were tools. The real gift was belief. He believed in me before I believed in myself. And perhaps that was the reason his final lessons arrived the way they did. Not through speeches, not through instructions, through discovery, through growth, through truth. If you are listening to my story right now and carrying your own invisible wounds, I hope you remember something I spent far too many years forgetting. Other people do not get to define your value. Not a spouse, not a parent, not a sibling, not a boss, not a crowd. Your worth does not disappear simply because someone else fails to recognize it. Sometimes the people around you only see the version of you that makes them comfortable. That does not mean it is the real version. Protect your peace, trust your instincts, learn your finances, understand your boundaries, and never abandon yourself in order to keep someone else comfortable. Looking back, the greatest victory was never keeping an inheritance. It was finding myself again. If this story touched something in your heart, perhaps take a quiet moment today to reflect on your own journey. And if you feel comfortable, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. You can also support the channel with a like or subscribe, but only if these stories genuinely bring value to your life. Sometimes a shared story reminds us that we are not nearly as alone as we think we are. The core lesson I carried away from all of this is simple. Never let anyone else's opinion become the foundation of your identity. As the last light of day disappeared beyond the horizon, I picked up my father's photograph and placed it beside the handwritten note he left me years ago. The ocean moved quietly beyond the window. The house felt warm. The future felt open. And for the first time in a very long time, I no longer felt like the daughter of a powerful man, the owner of a company, or the survivor of a betrayal. I simply felt like myself. Thank you for spending these moments with me, and if there is one thing life has taught me, it is that the people who truly belong in your story will never need you to become someone else in order to be loved.